Philip Hubbard has an amazing story, and he's
one of the biggest cases that's ever come out of the Florida courts, and I just think everybody should know about it. And I'm so glad that he wrote a book because he was the defense lawyer who was defending these guys who were innocent and still on death row, wound up
yeah,
serving time
yeah.
on death row, and it's just an amazing story.
You were familiar with this case. I was not. I'm guessing the majority of our audience will not be.
Mm-hmm.
So there's some background here that I'm going to read from at the witnesstoinnocence.org website. Freddie Lee Pitts and Wilbert Lee, both African-American, were convicted and sentenced to death for the 1963 murder of two white gas station attendants in Florida, despite a complete lack of physical evidence. Prosecutors used confessions that were extracted through beatings, testimony of a suspicious eyewitness, and polygraph tests taken under extreme duress to win their case. A few weeks after Freddie and Wilbert were sentenced to death, a white man sentenced to life for another homicide admitted to the killings. Despite learning of this confession, the local sheriff ignored it. A polygraph examiner who had heard the white man confess, took the matter to the press, and soon a new trial was ordered. But astonishingly, Freddie and Wilbert were again convicted. After the second conviction, the alleged witness recanted her testimony, and the state attorney general admitted that the state had unlawfully suppressed evidence. These guys did 12 years in prison.
On death row.
On death row. Freddie Lee Pitts would go on to become the first board chair at the Witness to Innocence Project, and that's an interesting organization that essentially works on the behalf of wrongfully convicted death row cases. Witness to Innocence is an organization of, by, and for death row exonerees. Our mission is to empower exonerated death row survivors to be the most powerful and effective voice in the fight to end the death penalty and reform the justice system in the United States. You can learn more about them at witnesstoinnocence.org. And we are going to learn a lot more right now about Freddie Lee Pitts and Wilbert Lee from Philip Hubbard, who is not only the author of the new book, From Death Row to Freedom, The Struggle for Racial Justice in the Pitts Lee Case, he was their defense attorney on appeal.
But before we start, I just want to mention Florida has the dubious distinction of being the state with the most people who were sent to death row who wound up being exonerated. Thanks so much for joining us today to talk about this very important case in Florida history. I think a lot of people don't know about it or don't remember it, and your book is very timely about that. Start off with the beginning. How did your two clients wind up sort of in the wrong place at the wrong time there in Port St. Joe?
Well, the crime was committed outside the town of Port St. Joe, which is on the eastern end of the Florida Panhandle, and it happened on the evening of July 31st, 1963. That was the height of the civil rights crisis in the South at that time. A lot of things happening that year. The two defendants were eventually picked up and interrogated at all hours of the day and night.
I want to give people a little sense of, the Mojo gas station there in Port St. Joe.
A little hamlet called Highland View, but it's right outside of Port St. Joe. Port St. Joe is about 4,000 population, a very small town. And so the two attendants on duty, Grover Floyd and Jesse Burkett, were held up at gunpoint and kidnapped from the station, taken a short distance from the station into the rural area and murdered. That's the basic the facts of the original case.
And Wilbert Lee and Freddie Pitts had been there that night, but not at the time of the crime. They had sort of just stopped by.
They were in there earlier and had left. There were some white people in the station as well. But the police centered on Pitts and Lee because they had been there that night, although they ignored the white people. And one of their group wanted to use the white-only restroom, and the attendants wouldn't let them do it because it was segregated. And a slight argument occurred. It wasn't real bad, but there was an argument. One of the ladies there I said, well, I come from Mobile, and we always use the same damn bathroom. But they wouldn't let him in. So that was it. They got back in the car. And by the way, Lee was making a phone call in a phone booth there and didn't hear the argument at all.
Wow.
And Pitts was the driver, and he didn't hear the argument either. So it wasn't that big a deal, but they all got in the car afterwards and left the station. And once the deputy sheriff, Wayne White, who was investigating it from Gulf County, found out about this argument from the white people that were there, he decided this was a black on white killing. And it's really amazing. There was the real robber, the real killer, was living right under their nose. They knew him. His name was Curtis Adams. He was the only person living in Gulf County, where this county happened, with a record for armed robbery. In fact, he was on parole for armed robbery.
Wow.
But he was white, and so they decided, no, this is a black on white killing, and that's why they picked him up. After that, they were interrogated all hours of the day and night. All these black people who were at the station earlier that night had just come from a party, and they went back to the party. And so what the police did, they arrested everybody that was involved in the party, including the people that had gone to the station, but some of them had. And they were treated like they had no rights at all. I mean, they just picked them up, and they kept them, most of them, until Pitts and Lee were sentenced to death, which was like a week later. 4 weeks later.
Wow.
It was no defense could possibly have been put up during that period of time. This was a steamroller atmosphere, if there ever was one.
They were beaten too, weren't they, while they were in the jail?
Oh yeah. Well, Pitts in particular was beaten very badly. What they did was they picked him up and they gave him a lie detector test. They brought in a guy who was really an incompetent from Florida Sheriff's Bureau named Joe Townsend. He kept testing them over and over again and acting like the police interrogator, like he's going to get confessions out of them, using the lie detector as a way of doing it. And finally, he decided Pitts knew where the bodies were. They hadn't discovered the bodies yet. They just assumed it was a murder because they couldn't find the two attendants. Townsend flunked Pitts. And so they took Pitts out in a car. Wayne White and George Kittrell, who was a deputy sheriff in Panama City, and who knew one of the attendants. And so he volunteered his services, and he got in the police car with Wayne White. Wayne White did the ride, and they went out in the countryside trying to find these bodies and forcing Pitts to tell him where it was. And of course, he didn't know anything. So Kittrell just kept hitting him on the side of his head, on the side of Pitts's head, with this blackjack, and they were out for 10 hours. This was an all night encounter, and they went all over. And when they brought him back, he was had lost consciousness. He was going in and out of consciousness, and it was so bad he really suffered from that the rest of that month. As to Lee, it's just so incredible. They arrested his wife, who wasn't she was at the station. She was Lee's alibi witness. I mean, and they never charged her with anything, but they picked her up, and along with all of the other black people who were at the party and at the station, and but she was his alibi witness. But at any rate, they questioned Lee, as they did Pitts, for about 6 days straight, sometimes all night. But he kept holding out. And so this one night, the officer told him, and he didn't know which one, because they took him to Panama City. They were afraid that he might be lynched in Port St. Joe. So they took him to Panama City, which is the biggest city in that area. Finally, said, she's going to talk tonight. And so with that, they hit Lee over the head a couple of times. And then they brought in his wife, and they threatened to electrocute her unless he confessed. And that's what broke him. They prepared a police written confession, and he just signed it. Now, what's really amazing about all this, ordinarily in these police interrogations, in any given criminal case, it's the defendant's word against the police. And ordinarily, the court accepts the police account. But in this case, you had two outside observers, two objective people. They were Army CID investigators. Pitts was in the Army at the time. He had no prior record at all. And he was at the Army. He was on maneuvers outside of Port St. Joe. And so he was AWOL once I picked him up, beat him up so badly and questioned him. So these two investigators came out to make a routine report. These were prosecution investigators for the Army. They testified in court martials. Bruce Potts and Donald Hogue. They were the independent witnesses that we had in this case. And they came and they were just appalled at the way the police were investigating this case. It was so racist. They used the N word constantly. They refused to let the two investigators talk to Pitts or see him. And they gave him a runaround. They would tell him, "No, this is a Gulf County case. You're going to have to talk to the sheriff of Gulf County." Then they go to the sheriff of Gulf County, and he said, "Well, they're in Panama City." I said, "I can't give you any information. You'll have to go back to the sheriff in Bay County." So they got the message. They weren't going to let him see him. And so they got permission from their provost at, forget the town he was actually stationed in. But anyway, they came back to stay longer than usual. And finally, they got to see Pitts after about, must have been 6 days, 6 or 7 days. And when they saw him, he was all beat up.
Man.
And they got him in a room, and he repudiated his confession. He had just signed from the police, and they gave a full statement to the two CID investigators that he was totally innocent of the crime. So this is a very unusual. So it wasn't just the defendant's word against the police. We had two independent outside observers that Pitts had been beaten up so badly. They were eventually assigned a lawyer because they had no money to hire one. They got Fred Turner, who was the most prominent criminal lawyer in the area. They might as well have appointed a prosecutor because not only did he do nothing for them, he joined the police in getting another confession out of them and told them they had to plead guilty and confess. The only way he could save them from the electric chair, they would have to confess. And Pitts was very reluctant to do this. Lee had already done it because he was scared to death they were going to electrocute his wife because his wife was still in police custody. So he agreed right away. But Pitts was giving him fits. He wouldn't. This all took place, by the way, with a sheriff present and Turner, and they brought down Willie Mae Lee, one of their. That's of course another story, and made her repeat her story, which is totally false. That's what these two men had done. But Pitts didn't want to confess, and so Turner told them, "Well, there's a conflict of interest now between the two guys here, and so I'll have to ask the court to relieve me of representing you. I can't represent you unless you confess." And sure enough, he confessed, and they went. They treated him, and they treated all these black people like had no rights whatever, and they got it all wrong. The guy who committed this murder was right under their nose. Curtis Adams, who escaped the next day. The morning after the murders, he escaped with his girlfriend. They went down to Fort Lauderdale. 16 days later, he commits the same kind of gas station hold-up murder and killed a gas station attendant who was on duty at night, just like he'd done in Port St. Joe. Took him out in the country and murdered him. Also, Mary Jane Akins, who broke up with him over this, I mean, she was scared to death of him after this. She testified that Curtis Adams confessed to her on the night of the murders that he'd murdered these two guys in order to get enough money for them to leave town.
It was about $100, wasn't it? That's all that was in the till that night.
Yeah, it was $100 taken in, and she was just amazed. She said, $100. I mean, she was thinking, $100. Two men have to die for $100. And anyway, and then the next night he confessed in greater detail to her. So we had two confessions right after the murders, and on top of that, eventually, through a series of really unusual events, Curtis Adams confessed to both the Port St. Joe murders and the Fort Lauderdale murders to the Fort Lauderdale police, the sheriff's office there. They brought in a lie detector man who took an incredible confession. I mean, it was an hour and a half on tape. The most dramatic confession I've ever heard in my life. We presented all this evidence to J. Frank Adams, who was the state attorney up there, and he refused to do anything about it. He refused to help us in any way. He just stonewalled us, and it took, another 6.5. Let's see, it'd have been from 1966 to 75, 8.5 years before we actually got them out.
How did you get involved in the case?
Oh, okay, that's an interesting story too, because that's a complete fluke. I was working as an assistant public defender in Miami, in the Dade County Public Defender's Office, a very small office in those days, and now it's enormous. They got about 250 lawyers, but at the time, I had only 7, and it was part-time. I was working full-time, however. I was doing all their appeals, which were quite a few, as many as 75 or 80 appeals, so it was really very hard work. I was working 24 hours almost sometimes.
Dang.
Anyway, these were all appeals from non-capital felonies, because at the time the PD's office did not handle capital crimes. So I volunteered my services, with the approval of my boss, volunteered my services to the ACLU legal panel here in Miami. And I'll take one of your pro bono cases. They represented everybody on death row. So they sent over this case. At the time, it was not a cause célèbre at all. I actually filed a motion to set aside their convictions based on the grounds that the grand jury which indicted them was selected from a venire from which blacks had been systematically excluded. The ACLU did a statistical study on the grand jury, and I found out that only one black person, had served actually on the Gulf County grand jury from 1948 to 1963. I mean, the discrimination was absolutely blatant. But of course, the court up there is not unsympathetic and denied our motion. We took an appeal to the First District. That was affirmed. We took an appeal to the Supreme Court, and that's when this case broke wide open. That's when I found out about the confession and all this other stuff. And
so how did you find out about the confessions being coerced?
The defendants, Pitts in particular, said he was in the Army. I should try to get in touch with the investigator that investigated us. And so Warren Holmes, who had actually gotten the confession, was the polygraph examiner that the sheriff's office in Fort Lauderdale called up. So we eventually got in touch with him, or he got in touch with me, really, and told me about all this. And they gave a full statement to Warren, and of course it revealed what had happened to them when they got arrested. That's how we found out about all that.
What do you remember about meeting the defendants for the first time in person?
Ordinarily, when you're handling appeals, you don't really need to talk to the clients because on these indigent cases, at any rate, because the record simply what is the record which is handled at the trial court level, and they're not allowed to introduce new evidence on appeal or anything. But after the case broke wide open with this confession, I went up to see them at Rayford, and they were the best clients I ever had. And I handled hundreds of clients as a public defender, hundreds of them. They were the best clients I ever had. They were very nice, very easy to get along with. It was a dramatic meeting, although not as dramatic as when Warren went up there. Warren Holmes went up there first and ran a lie detector test on both of them, and then told them that they were innocent of the murders. And that was I got that in the book in some detail. That's how I met them.
The wife of Mr. Lee and these bystanders, these black bystanders at the convenience store who were held in police custody, I'm guessing without being arrested. So this is sort of like state-sponsored kidnapping. How was that justified? On what grounds were they held for so long? Were they arrested? That detail of essentially rounding up witnesses and holding them against their will with no real cause it astonishes me.
Yeah, well, it astonishes me too. That's exactly what they did, and they held them they tried to justify it on the grounds of, well, yeah, we never charged them with a crime, but we were holding them as material witnesses. And I said, did you get a court order for that? No. You need a court order to do this. It was blatantly illegal. Everything they did, they had no probable cause to arrest these guys to begin with. They'd been on the station earlier, but there were a bunch of white people too. But they never did anything with these white guys.
Then there was no physical evidence tying him to the crime.
No, there never was. They brought in the sheriff's bureau, and they did some fingerprinting in Pitts's car. They tried to find, and they got the fingerprints from the two men that were abducted and killed, and weren't able to find any matches at all. They took them out on location to find the gun, never did. They also claimed that Pitts had hit one of the men over the side of the head with a tire jack. So they hunted for that tire jack. They never found the tire jack. They didn't have anything. They just had confessions from the two defendants and a confession from a third woman who was also black, and they terrorized her, Willie Mae Lee. And they held her in custody, too, until Pitts and Lee were sentenced to death. They treated these people like had no rights at all. It was so shocking, the way they'd handled it. And Potts and Hogue, the two CID investigators, they were equally appalled. And these guys were, they were like police officers for the government.
Mm-hmm.
And they were absolutely appalled and filed reports at the time that this was what had happened to Pitts and how bad they were treated.
Yeah.
And in incredible days.
In 1963, if you're a black man in the Florida Panhandle and the cops are saying they will electrocute your wife, you take that seriously.
Yeah.
You sign anything you're willing to, and the same thing with the so-called witness. If you're being held against your will, you haven't been arrested for anything, but you're sort of in custody, and you're saying, now you're going to tell me that those guys did it, right? You're going to testify to this.
That's right.
You're in a.
Well, they threatened her with the electric chair. They told her if she didn't confess, they were going to charge her. She was doing all she could to protect herself.
Yeah, save your own life. Now, clearly this area, this police department was racist, bigoted, on and on and on. Did it have a reputation for this? Was this a pattern of behavior you were able to subsequently find?
Well, no, we didn't have any occasion to investigate whether these officers engaged in this kind of work, but this kind of activity, behavior in all cases. But one of the things they told the sheriff in Bay County in Panama City, Doc Daffin, he said he would tell these of his associates who are bringing in witnesses all the time, they're conducting lie detector tests like mad, one after another, and accusing all these black people of lying. Yeah, I'm sure this. But anyway, one of the things that they told the CID people, he says, the way to get these, and they use the N word, of course, throughout, to get any of these black people to say what we wanted to hear, and we just had to threaten to take their hair, shave their hair off their head, and electrocute them, put them in the electric chair.
Man.
They saw him mistreating witnesses, and they filed reports to that effect. I just assume that's the way they operated.
Which is probably safe. From the.
This is the one time they got caught. How did Gene Miller get involved in this? Gene Miller, the legendary Miami Herald reporter.
That's an interesting story too. Warren Holmes, who is the one who got this long tape-recorded confession from Curtis Adams in Fort Lauderdale. They were investigating, by the way, the Fort Lauderdale police were investigating the murder of Floyd McFarland, who was the gas station attendant in Fort Lauderdale that Adams had taken out of the country and murdered. So once Warren had gotten this full confession from, and I've included that in the book, and I think I defy anybody to read that confession, which is extremely detailed on all kinds, and he probe their motivations and everything, I defy anybody to listen or read that and come to the conclusion that this guy was lying. He was not. He was telling the truth.
Mm-hmm.
But at any rate, Warren had worked with Gene Miller on prior cases. This kind of what Gene liked to do is to investigate claims of innocence of people who were in prison. And they had worked together on a prior case. And so Warren just went directly to Gene because we got another one. And that's how Gene got involved. He was a godsend. I'll tell you, he kept this case alive. He kept this case on the front page of the Miami Herald for the next 8.5 years. He wrote well over 100.
Quite a few, yeah. And then he wound up doing a book on it as well, right? Invitation to a Lynching.
He did a book, right. He did a book, and he's the one really who got the pardon, the eventual pardon. Because where it eventually wound up, they were pardoned on the ground of innocence by the governor and the Florida cabinet, and they eventually, in April of 1998, they were given $500,000 apiece for their 12 years of known wrongful imprisonment.
Yeah, $500,000 sounds like a lot of money. I wouldn't trade it for 12 years in Rayford.
That's right.
They were in the legal proceedings. Okay, they were eventually pardoned. The legal proceedings in which you were their defense attorney, how did you overturn the guilty verdict?
Well, we lost in the Florida courts. We lost completely. We did get a new trial for them. There was a long hearing conducted in 1968 September because we filed a motion to set aside the convictions. We had a lot of law going against us on this, but we eventually won that. The Supreme Court eventually affirmed it. We went back and tried the case, but again we lost. And at that point, Gene Miller said that he was getting tired of all this work in the courts, and maybe we should just go to the governor and see if we can't get a pardon.
Well, did they not admit the Curtis Adams confession? Is that why you lost the second time?
Oh yeah, they right. The judge was up from North Florida, from Ocala. He was part of the Good Old Boy Network up there, and he excluded all the Curtis Adams confessions and all the other evidence that he committed a very similar crime 16 days later.
Well, and still the utter lack of physical evidence tying your clients to the case. You still got no murder weapon. You've still got no fingerprints, no DNA. I mean, this is,
No. Oh, they had no DNA in those days. In fact, this is really the granddaddy of all the known wrongful convictions, I think, because at that time, in 1963, it was unheard of that anybody would get exonerated off death row. I mean, this just didn't happen.
Yeah.
And DNA came into being, much later, 20, 30 years later.
It was ultimately the governor and the legislature that let them out of prison. It wasn't a trial. Yeah. It wasn't jurors.
Governor and cabinet.
Cabinet, okay.
Yeah, while our case was pending in the U.S. Supreme Court, what Gene Miller did was he had no official role in the case, of course. And we could not apply for a pardon because there was a practice, and there still is a practice, that the cabinet, including the governor, will not entertain pleas for clemency while the case is still pending in the courts. So pending in the courts, they won't touch it. It's only when you've given up on the courts, then you can come and file something and ask for leniency or a pardon or whatever. So we couldn't officially sign anything. And so what Gene did was he just sent letters to the governor's office, and the governor and tried to lay out the case for a pardon. Fortunately, I mean, the governor, who was Governor Reuben Askew, he could have just said, "I'm not entertaining this until you've exhausted all of your appeals." Mm-hmm. That's what every governor had done up to that point. But he knew some of the people involved in this case. He was from Pensacola, and he knew some of the people, and he knew what they were capable of. And I think that's the reason that he decided to take this seriously himself.
And when you
And
say he knew them, he knew what they were. He wasn't buddies with them. They weren't like fishing
he
pals.
knew
I mean,
what they were capable.
he knew
Yeah.
these guys. Yeah, and this didn't surprise him that you might actually be telling the truth here about this
Exactly.
steamroller job. Yeah,
and Dean also sent a copy of the book even before it was published in the page proofs. He wrote this book solely for one audience, and that was the governor.
Wow.
And when he got to, and then after you told me this personally, he spent more time on this issue, these 2 terms as governor, than he did on any other issue.
No kidding.
That he was involved in. He what he did was in the evenings, often what he would do, he was a lawyer himself. He would get on the phone and question witnesses. And he was a very good lawyer. So it was just amazing. Another amazing thing too was that the nephew of one of the killers, one of the people who were killed, Jesse Burkett, Chris Burkett is his nephew. Chris was not living in that area. He had gotten a job in California somewhere on one of the newspapers there, and he read about the case in the papers somewhere up there, and came back, and it sounded like to him that these men were innocent. He went to see Pitts and Lee and became totally convinced. I don't know how he got in, frankly, but he did. He talked to Pitts and Lee, and he was convinced they were innocent, and he kept sending letters to the governor too. Wow. He got to look into this.
Did the actual trigger man on these murders ever do time for him?
No, they refused to prosecute him. However, the state attorney in Broward County prosecuted him for the murder of Floyd McFarland. He got life imprisonment for that one.
So he didn't even end up on death row like Pitts and Lee did.
He died in prison.
Oh my goodness!
Was there any consequences for the law enforcement people who were involved in this?
None whatever. They knew they could get away with this stuff. They've been doing it for years, I'm sure. And treating blacks as second-class citizens. And we were talking earlier about, was this a one-off case? I'm sure that the deputy sheriff who was investigating this case in Gulf County, this was the only homicide case he ever had. Up to that point, anyway. He may have had one since then. They were under enormous pressure to solve this crime. Enormous pressure.
Well, it sounds like they were under enormous pressure to tag someone as guilty, not solve the crime.
Yeah.
And those are two very different things, obviously.
In fact, they weren't interested in solving the crime. If they were, they'd have gone out and picked up Curtis Evans, or at least gone out and talked to him, and pursued that lead. Wayne White knew Curtis Evans personally. Wayne White was the deputy sheriff. He knew him personally.
Wait, he knew him?
He knew he was capable of it.
How did he know this guy who had just gotten out of prison?
How did he know him? Well, he was a longtime resident of Port St. Joe. It's a very small town, 4,000 people. And this guy, of course, had gotten in trouble. He had held up a gas station in, I believe it was in Panama City, and got 10 years for that. And then he was eventually got parole. He went back home. So White knew this guy, and he actually told one of the Fort Lauderdale police officers that he was a suspect initially, until he found out about this argument over the restroom, which is idiotic. Because somebody would that's no motive for murder. That's absurd, But they said that's a black on white, and you just could not get him off that. That was it. And Curtis Adams is a liar, and besides that, he's white, and this was a black on white killing.
Oh, man.
Did this case and the trial have any impact towards improving the treatment of black defendants going through the system on capital cases? Was anything learned from this? Did anything change as a result of this, or is this just happening largely in a vacuum with only Freddie Lee Pitts and Wilbert Lee as the beneficiaries of the agony they endured?
Well, the short answer is it had no impact at all.
Okay.
What had the impact was his case, Gideon against Wainwright, which decided in '63, just about the same time as these crimes were taking place. This case was taking place in 1963. As a result of that decision, the case was retried in Panama City. It arose out of Panama City. And the defendant was acquitted with a lawyer. And the lawyer's name was Fred Turner, who eventually wound up representing Pitts and Lee.
Oh, man.
What happened after the Gideon case was that the powers that be in the legislature and I think in the governor's office and so on decided that the best thing to do would be to establish a public defender system in Florida. And they did, and established there was a public defender in every circuit in the state, 20 circuits. There's a state attorney elected, and there's a public defender elected. That came into being the year afterwards in 1964.
Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, because that's one of the most famous is a strange word to describe it. Let's just say important cases in American history of the American court system. It required defendants to have access to an attorney, whether or not they could afford it. And again, so we're thinking 1963, the idea that there was no such thing as public defenders at this time, which we sort of hold as, as like bedrock to the equity and fairness of the American legal system. It's right. You're talking about
it's a recent development.
it sounds like you're talking about something that John Adams presided over. We should have probably a public defender system. Well, of course, that all makes sense for everyone. And it's 1787 right, exactly. And not 1963, for God's sakes. Yeah. Holy cow. And that was a Florida case on top of it. Yeah.
So now you got a pretty decent system in this state. And the Capital Crimes Division, for example, in the Public Defender's Office down here is extremely well qualified and extremely able criminal lawyers. As I say, there was a Supreme Court case in the 30s which said a defendant charged with a capital crime was entitled to court-appointed counsel. Well, they appointed Fred Turner, and Turner was the one who got Gideon off on retrial. That's one of the ironies of this case.
Yeah. Gideon,
but Clarence Gideon was white.
Yeah, I was just going to say,
white, and it was a burglary case. It was a burglary of a pool room, and he got him off. But he just threw these guys in. I mean, he pled them guilty with no plea deal. Wow. I mean, nobody does that. No criminal lawyer does that. That's classic malpractice. You don't plead people guilty unless you get an agreement. What's the point in doing it? You might as well go to trial.
Yeah.
But he was, I think, this is just my opinion, but I think he felt like he would lose his law practice if he stood up for these guys. I mean, this was the height of the civil rights crisis in the South. All kinds of things that had happened in 1963, and all culminated in that horrendous bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham.
Yeah, that's March on Washington. It's just before the Civil Rights Act is passed. So again, put yourself in the era. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. That's what makes the case so important to me. It's part of the civil rights history of this country. It ranks right up there with this Scottsboro Boys case and Emmett Till, Rosa Parks, everything that was happening during that period. That's why I wrote the book. I wrote the book so this case could be remembered.
It's an essential book, and I hope people will read it.
Yeah, the book From Death Row to Freedom, The Struggle for Racial Justice in the Pitts-Lee Case. Philip Hubert, not only the author, he was the defense attorney. No one knows it like he does. Wow, thank you so much for your time today. This has been wonderful.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me.
When we think about and we hear these words, systemic racism, institutional racism, and when the governor and other members of the right wing want to believe that they don't exist, this is what you're talking about. The inability to get a fair trial based on race alone.
And think about it. The result of this wasn't just the horribly wrong jailing of two innocent men, but it was also that the real murderer got off. He was never prosecuted for this, even though he confessed to it and gave a very detailed confession. And was never held to account for that.
12 years, man. Do 12 years in Big Boy State Prison in Rayford for something you weren't even on the scene of, where someone else has confessed to it. Oh, and by the way, you got your ass kicked for about 12 hours. So you were tortured. Yeah. Okay. Not only were you shanghaied, you were tortured. They threatened your wife. Yeah. They held her, essentially, the police kidnapped that woman.
Yeah.
Okay. We go, oh, she was held in custody and they were material witnesses. Well, if they were witnesses, did they get to testify? I'm guessing not. So we've got
strictly an intimidation tactic. Yeah.
Police kidnapping and threatening witnesses, beating confessions out of people, and two guys who are totally innocent doing 12 years in state prison. Welcome to Florida.
Yeah. Welcome to Florida.